of cocoa production in Ghana. Our next speaker will be Professor Ruth Hall from PLAS, who's well known at this and locally, of course. She's helping to frame the land debate in South Africa. She serves as a member of the President's Advisory Panel on Land Reform. Professor Issa Shirji was an academic for, I think, something like 40 years as a professor of law at the University of Dar es Salaam, and then as the Julius Nyerere Professorial Chair in Pan-African Studies. At the moment, he's the director of the Nyerere Resource Center. He's published many books on land and related issues in Tanzania and in Africa. And he chaired the Presidential Commission of Inquiry into Land Matters in Tanzania in 91-92. So this is a very eminent array of scholars, and I think that their perspectives will reflect not only the understandings of the diversity of conditions across the continent, but also the particular conditions faced in their countries and regions, which are somewhat different to one another. Okay, so just by way of introduction, what is the agrarian question? And why is it relevant today? So, usually the agrarian question has capital letters on it, denoting something very serious. It emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it really focused on the role of agriculture in the transition to capitalism, which was still an ongoing process in many parts of the world. In particular, this debate emerged in the context of Marxist scholarship on issues to do with the structure of capitalism, its history, and where it was headed to. In particular, the agrarian question, the debate around it focused on the formation of the distinctive classes of the capitalist mode of production, that is the proletariat, masses of working people, and the capitalist class. Of course, there are other classes as well. In both urban contexts, of course, capitalism came into being initially in relatively small-scale societies, but by the time industrialization was beginning in England in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was associated with industrial development. But also the agrarian question deals with classes in rural contexts. So there are three dimensions to the classical agrarian question. One is the question of politics. We'll put that first and foremost. It's a question of class alliances. Alliances of capital, different kinds, but also alliances of the rural masses, the peasantry, and emerging proletarian classes. So there's a contested politics of what the role of agriculture is in these transitions. There's also, that's sometimes called agrarian question one. Agrarian question two is around production. It's around the creation of the investment and improvement in the forces of production, partly in order, of course, to create a surplus to feed an emerging urban proletariat, but with other connections to this emerging capitalist economy. Agrarian question three is in part the contribution of agriculture to the development of these societies that were undergoing this transition more generally. It was the problematic of accumulation and the use of a surplus produced in the rural economy for purposes of industrialization, either through taxation and then reinvestment via the state, but also through creating a market for manufactured goods. So these three problematics are closely interwoven with one another. And the literature on these issues suggests that there's a great diversity of pathways, of ways of engaging with these questions in transitions. There's not one pathway. The classical transition in England, theorized by Marx, Das Kapital, is not replicated elsewhere. And of course, there's also a great many different takes on this question. There's a diversity of viewpoints. It's not as though there's an established dogma around these questions. It's an issue alive with controversy and debate. So, three questions for the agrarian question in the 21st century and in Africa. Is this classical way of posing the agrarian question still relevant today, given globalization, given the dominance of capitalist relations across the world, given the shift of large sectors of the global population away from the countryside to urban areas and the relatively small place of agriculture in wider economies. Is the agrarian question still relevant at all? One answer to that question, provided by Henry Bernstein, very controversial, was that from the point of view of capital, the agrarian question is resolved, but from the point of view of classes of labor, it is not resolved as yet. In other words, he split the agrarian question into these two components. That's controversial. I wonder what our speakers have to say about that. Secondly, is there a distinctive southern perspective on the agrarian question, or even a distinctive African perspective, given the fact that parts of the world are not equal, and that we have to take the combined and uneven development of capitalism crucially into account? Are these is the classical version northern-centric? And is it misleading as a result? So I think they will address that question as well. And thirdly, and often this didn't form part of the classical question at all, where is the ecological dimension? We live in a world in which sustainability of our living on the planet is in question. What does the rethinking the agrarian question have to say about that issue? So that's all I'm going to say by way of setting the scene. And we're now going to have our three speakers, one after another, for 15 minutes each, offering their thoughts. So get ready for the debate which will follow, jotting down your own thoughts and questions. Those can be questions of clarity, but they can also be arguments that you yourself want to make. Right. Okay, so let's have our first speaker, Professor Kojo Amano from University of Ghana.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, in looking at this question of the agrarian question in West Africa, I will look at it historically, since it's essentially about the nature of agrarian change. And I look at the three major periods of accumulation, agrarian accumulation in West Africa. So West Africa has a very long history of integration into international agricultural production, into export crop production, which goes back to the early 19th century. Yeah. So by 1820s, oil palm became a major export from West Africa into Germany, UK, and France. And this was followed by cocoa, groundnuts in the Senegambia and northern Nigeria, and cotton. Yeah. All of these developed in the 19th century. Forms of commodification of land also developed in the 19th century. From early 19th century, there were land sales on the Gold Coast, and land was being sold in Lagos from the 1860s. So before colonialism, West Africa was integrated into forms of agricultural production for industries. Yeah. And the coastal regions in West Africa, which emerged in West Africa, and which was based on these forms of peasant production, yeah, and the hierarchical accumulation within peasant production, So under indirect rule, peasant production was considered the most efficient and cheap forms of production in Africa. But while the base was dominated by peasant production, the marketing of crops was dominated by consolidation of European companies. And by the 30s, 40s, there were three companies which dominated the whole of marketing in West Africa, of which one was UAC, CFAO, and SCOA. Yeah. And there were large labor markets which were highly scientific infrastructure and experimental research stations started in the 1950s. And before that, production was largely controlled by an alliance of colonial administration with chiefs who established bylaws. And this encouraged considerable discontent among, which was manifest in boycotts within the cocoa industry, but also went into the anti-colonial struggle in many areas which had strong peasant basis here. And so by the end of the colonial period, this base was quite fragile, and attempts were created to transform it, to develop a new approach. Yeah. But this didn't really develop until the independence period. The other major consequence of this focus on export crops was increasing importation of foods to meet the needs of the urban sector, particularly of export of oils. Yeah. So the first initiatives in modern large-scale productions were focused on addressing this concern, developing groundnuts, oil palm, and then cereal crops as a method of addressing the food question. And this continued through the early independence period, which was essentially a period of experimentation in developing a new agrarian base based on promoting agro-industries. And this drew from a number of sources. It drew from American models of modernization, but it also drew from Soviet experimentations in state farms, cooperatives, and this formed the basis of an attempt to create an agri-industrial base within the 60s. So, two forms of agrarian accumulation developed in this period. The first was state investments in agriculture and state linkages with the peasantry through forms of state farms, production zones which produced the main sources of revenues. So these new forms of agriculture were not established by expropriating the peasantries within the major export producing zones, but establishing new frontier zones of agricultural modernization, often in the transition zones which were not highly populated, establishing the beginnings of irrigation infrastructures. And promoting new areas of peasant agricultural production, using modern inputs, providing tractor services, and So this continued through the 60s and 70s in still an experimental form. And during the 70s, there were several problems in this production, which partly related to the world food crisis and the world energy crisis, which resulted in increasing costs of fertilizers. But also to the Sahelian drought of the 1970s, and erratic weather conditions and drought, which often resulted in bankruptcy for commercial farmers. And this phase of development came to an end by the 1980s, where there were major transformations in agribusiness, in world production, and imposition of structural adjustment, which opened up African societies to external investments. So since then, the major forms of accumulation have resulted in the decline of state investments in agriculture and their replacement by agribusiness. But in most cases, this does not address the question of national agricultural research capacity building, because the research capacities of these agribusiness companies are not nationally rooted. And secondly, the decline of the whole agri-industrial sector does not produce a diverse agricultural sector which can address the employment needs of workers and youth, and provide sufficient support for creating a diverse agricultural economy. So the agricultural economy becomes defined by sectors in which agribusiness is interested in investing. And the major developments of this have been in establishing new forms of governance in which agribusiness controls, through relationships with states, but with NGOs and farmers' associations, controls are established over these production patterns for export crop production. In recent years, the second phase has included a focus now on encouraging increased use of inputs and new seeds and investments in developing food production for local markets. The question whether this addresses the food is debatable, whether this addresses the food question, because this occurs among increasing expansion of food imports, particularly of rice and other staples. And these developments are leading to increasing consumption of inputs by peasant farmers, which provides sources of markets for agribusiness. And often these new forms of agricultural economy are based on intensive technologies, use of mechanized inputs, herbicides, all of which have impacts on the environment. But because the state plays a peripheral role in agricultural production, the monitoring of these developments is questionable, often leading to new forms of land degradation. So the dominant
dominance of agribusiness. So that's in a way reframing the agrarian question. But perhaps we'll come back to other remarks to pulling out the chief thrust of the argument, building on that rich empirical presentation. Next presentation, Professor Ruth Hall from PLAS on Southern Africa.
Substantial land dispossession to make way for large-scale industrial forms of agriculture, capitalist agriculture, by a white minority alongside labor reserves. So the distinction that I would draw between the West African context that Kojo has outlined and the Southern African reality is the creation of agrarian dualism that has particular challenges for how we think of the agrarian question. And this dualism between capitalist agriculture on the one hand and peasant agriculture located within the labor reserves or tribal areas of Southern Africa was based not only on the accumulation of capital through agriculture, but particularly the production of landless working class that could be absorbed as cheap labor into mining. And I think that is a particular feature of the Southern African context. Two key processes that I want to draw attention to that have marked Southern Africa but equally other parts of the continent. The first is a long-term process of de-agrarianization. So structural adjustment following the oil crisis of the 1970s contributed to declines in smallholder agriculture, often pushing rural out-migration.